The actual news this week was Trump coming out against Putin. We had a truly remarkable Truth Social post kind of giving Ukraine some props for blowing up refineries and saying, oh, they should take all their territory back and maybe even more. Who knows? Good luck to everyone. Speaking of like the sort of like Rubio X factor, right? I mean, in public, we have seen him be absolutely in lockstep with the sort of like beat up on Ukraine strategy, which I think all of us have a pretty high degree of confidence in him not actually believing in, not even his heart of hearts, but like one level below the outer shell of what he's portraying to the world. So, now he's the national security advisor and the secretary of state. Like the types of briefings that Trump gets are probably, clearly like those talking points had to come from somewhere, right? So, I don't know, maybe this is just like Rubio was playing the long game, or Trump got sick of Putin's bullshit. I mean, what are your guys' takes on this move?
I think that Trump has this sort of A/B testing mentality of foreign policy, where he tries out different things at different times and sees how it's taken, both by the American public and by adversaries and allies, and runs with where it's going to work and isn't afraid to pivot. And that's new. I don't think any other president's really done that, and this feels like another one of those.
But it took
Yeah,
a
I think that's
long
really
time
good.
for him to get to the B of this test, right? I mean, he was pretty consistent for 6 months now, or I guess
Yeah, but
September, like
we
9 months.
can't discount that there was a whole group of people who were saying that what we could do is split China and Russia, and we could win Russia over. And then like we had the Xi summit with Putin and Modi, and like the impact, because that's really where it started. That was where we started seeing Trump like effectively saying like, I'm acknowledging that you three, Modi may be on the line, but like that at least you two are against us, and that's becoming an issue. And then like this is kind of like the next step from that. So it did take it a while, but I think it was precipitated in part by was it the Victory Day celebrations that they had in China.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about that. There was at least an ambition to, like, hey, like, all the big leaders of the world, they're all on the same page, right? And then it's very clear that that's not what's happening, because as we talked about last week, the enemy still gets a vote, and the enemy is still voting against us. And so, I'm a little bit skeptical that this will last long, only because you still need aid packages, right? Voicing support for Ukraine is good. But you still need the aid packages. You still need the Europeans to get their acts together. I did see today, it looks like the Ukrainians are successfully encircling some degree of Russian forces in the east. It's not a lost war. And I think that might be a part of it too, is I think a lot of folks who were not read in were like, oh, it's a lost war. And that is very much not the case. A lot of folks, Rob Lee and others, talked about 2025 going into 26 being, kind of the peak of Russia's ability to produce, particularly manpower and ammo. And there very well be analysis that says, hey, 26 is the year the Ukrainians really start driving them back.
Well, and I will say this: at minimum, Trump statements had an impact on the Russian troll farms, because we instantly started seeing them trying to link the attempted assassination to Ukraine, and link I think even the Charlie Chris's assassination, the shooter to Ukraine and Ukraine support. So they started very quickly like starting to push out their their data, which I think is going to feed nicely into.
And with that, we're going to formally introduce today's and the first ever second breakfast guest, Anthony Vinci, who wrote The Fourth Intelligence, The Future of Espionage and the Battle to Save America. He was the first chief technology officer at NGA. He spent a long time in the intelligence community. Let's start by running through our ages of intelligence. You have this nice schema for us of the heroic age, the Cold War golden age, and then into the chaotic age. What do you think are the kind of archetypes why did you cut the history of espionage into those classifications?
Well, I really the birth of the book was I had been in the intelligence community. I went to Iraq and places like that and kind of grew up in that kind of GWAT era of intelligence. I left the community and then I came back as the CTO of NGA and watched as the entire intelligence community changed. And all of a sudden we shifted from, during this time period that I was there, from kind of counterterrorism, counterinsurgency focus to a counter China, or, call it great power competition focus. And then after I left the agency again and I left intelligence, I took a step back and said, you know what, this is not the first time that this has happened. And, I look back at World War II to start and realize that's kind of the big bang of United States intelligence. That's where we had intelligence before that, but it was essentially military in nature. We did not like having peacetime agencies. We didn't like centralizing intelligence in any way. We were very skeptical of it. But in World War II, the birth of the OSS, we really created the foundation for American intelligence that's still around. And then if you kind of keep tracking the history, we had this second revolution from there, where as we got into the Cold War, that skepticism of intelligence came back. Truman shut down the OSS. He did not want there to be an American Gestapo, in essence. But then we realized we were getting into this Cold War. That Cold War was heavily going to involve intelligence competition, and we were going to have to stand up intelligence again. And in 1947, we did that with the stand-up of the CIA. And at that point, we had this completely new, completely different approach to intelligence, where now it was peacetime. It was professionalized. We had multiple agencies that specialized in things. And that sort of ran up until around 9/11, where that, I talk about this in the book, that professionalized, I call it the golden age of intelligence, got so good at counterintelligence and at being these compartmented intelligence agencies. We had blowback from it, because what happened in 9/11 is we were so hyper compartmented that, an attack got through. And that led to this next revolution, which I had served under, and many of us had post 9/11, and then now we're in the fourth one.
I have another prop for us. I want to talk about that 9/11 transition for a second. I was in a wonderful comic book store in San Francisco, which somehow had a 9/11 report in graphic novel format. Highly recommend it. Has a blurb by Stan Lee. Stan Lee has read this. But talk a little bit about the sort of why the Cold War led, what was the adaptation that helped you lead the Cold War that led to all the compartmentalization, such that in the first 30 pages of this graphic novel, you have dots blinking from the FBI and dots blinking from the CIA, and there's no one to sort of get up together.
Yeah, good question. I mean, the way I look at it, during the Cold War, we were up against the KGB, which at the time and probably now might have been the best intelligence agency to ever operate in history, in terms of their capabilities and in terms of their mentality and approach. And we had to adapt to that. And remember, America had really no standing agency going into that. And the only way to compete with an agency like that, like the KGB, was to steel yourself by compartmenting everything, being extremely paranoid about intelligence and counterintelligence threats and moles and all of those things that we sort of, most of us associate to this day as the core of intelligence. And we compartmented within agencies, and we compartmented between agencies, where the CIA might not tell the NSA what it's doing and vice versa. We compartmented severely between the intelligence agencies and everybody else in government, to include law enforcement like the FBI. And so as the Cold War came to a close, that culture continued, those organizational structures continued, and the enemies like Al Qaeda were able to slip through the cracks between those compartments because Al Qaeda was operating domestically, which is a law enforcement issue primarily, and internationally. And so you had a situation where the CIA might be seeing some things, the FBI might be seeing other things, but because there was this culture and these organizational processes that did not allow them to share information, they could not see all of the pieces of the plan. They could not connect the dots, which is a term that really came out after 9/11 to describe what we needed to do, and we could not do that. And so they were eventually able to get a big attack through. And they had tried multiple attacks before that, but 9/11 was the biggest one.
Just sticking on that for a moment, how much do you think was it the Cold War and the compartmentalization that led to like kind of like almost the explosion of overclassification, where we would see secret into top secret into the compartments, or did the classification contribute to the compartmentalization? Which one do you think like happened first?
I think they went hand in hand, right? Where we essentially borrowed from the British. Our American intelligence agencies were trained by and borrowed from MI6 and to a degree MI5, and they had already at that time created compartments. They had secrecy, they had classification, and so we kind of came into it with that mentality a little bit, and then it evolved over time in our American system to an even more complex situation where you had even more compartments, even more classification levels. And then at the same time, and I would add this in, there's this sort of mixture of the politics of it all. And politics in terms of what agencies wanted to share with the Hill and with other people who were part of the government, as it related to covert action, for example, and politics about what should be shared with the American people. And there was also the politics within these agencies, and I talk about this a little bit in the book. There's a bureaucratic angle of compartmentalization and classification where it's used as essentially a weapon to win bureaucratic battles. If you don't want somebody else to raid your budget, you sap a program, and you can do things like that. And if you mess up, you can sap the program. And so people can't see that you messed up. So all of these pieces came together and kind of led to this kind of hyper compartmented organizational structure.
Which is not great. And so we had some shiny new legislation in the early 2000s. That was fine. Or what's our transition? All right. So 9/11 I'll let you do it. 9/11 happens, and all of a sudden everyone really cares about this stuff. There's a lot of attention on the Hill. What is the next stage in building our GWAT chaotic age of the next intelligence community's evolution?
Yeah. Because of that compartmentalization and an investigation into it in the 9/11 Commission report, we expanded the scope of intelligence and created the intelligence community, the IC, as essentially everyone in the community calls it now, where we no longer just treated intelligence as something that was done by a few specific agencies, NSA, DIA, NRO, CIA. Oh man.
It's the beauty.
I know.
You just cut stuff.
Yeah, that's great.
Great work. Okay, now the question I have, this is too long. So I'm gonna do it again. All right, we have and then we have this like really dramatic reformulation, as you argue, not something that was seen since the late 1940s. So what gets born in the aftermath of that?
Yeah, ultimately, after 9/11 and after the 9/11 Commission report, there was this idea that the way to secure the nation was to use what some people call a whole of government approach, to say that we need to expand national security to include all of the agencies, and that included intelligence. And so we created something called the intelligence community, and now included not just the agencies that most people thought of as being intelligence agencies like NSA and CIA, but also included components within other government departments that might also be involved with intelligence. So now the FBI was part of and became part of this intelligence community. And even places like the Department of Treasury or even the Department of Transportation might be now involved in intelligence. And this was the solution for how do we connect the dots and how do we stop adversaries that might try to slip between the cracks between domestic and foreign and transportation and energy and finance and other threat vector areas. And that was a huge and radical transformation.
So how does the adaptation for that paradigm set up the U.S. well and poorly for whatever's going to come next for our fourth intelligence revolution?
Yeah. Well, the other thing that started to happen during that time period was also this expansion into incorporating non-government entities into the intelligence process. The CIA created something called InQtel, which is a venture capital organization run as a nonprofit, but essentially controlled by the CIA and done publicly. We also began to use a lot more open source intelligence, which is intelligence that comes from non-classified means. Think of it as, CIA analysts who are reading, newspapers from foreign countries or using financial data from banks and things like that. That was kind of the seed of what was going to happen next. And what I talk about in the book is that we're moving from not a whole of government approach, but a whole of society approach. And the reason is that the competitive landscape now is not just your traditional military and political intelligence when the US is competing with China and other adversaries. It's essentially everything. It's science and technology, it's economics, it's business, it's even things like genetics, where you have the PRC collecting genetic information from people. So all of a sudden, the scope of what intelligence is incorporates essentially everything within society and the economy and politics. And now what I believe is happening is that the intelligence community has to expand into the scope of almost everything, where now you're going to incorporate companies into this intelligence community, and ultimately even regular people who will become part of it and become, in fact, targets within the intelligence competition. And nonprofits and even foreign countries will become part of this whole of society approach to intelligence.
So to that degree, I think there's a lot of folks who would say that sounds an awful lot like mobilizing the population. What is the difference between that intelligence revolution and perhaps some of the more nefarious approaches that, the Stasi and the KGB had of this idea of that everyone is a source?
I think that there is essentially an American way of intelligence. And that is based on this innate skepticism of Americans as it relates to intelligence and secret police and the government in general. There's a culture of this that goes back to the beginning of the nation. And most Americans kind of believe this. I would say even most intelligence officers have a little bit of that skeptical, call it kind of libertarian view, where we don't like the idea of a government, especially our own government, spying on us or using us in intelligence. At the same time, however, we've run into this issue, which is the competitive landscape is wider. and does incorporate all of these things. And whether we like it or not, foreign adversaries are spying on American citizens. So how do you deal with that? This is a true dilemma. And what I suggest in the book, the way to deal with this, is to still have an intelligence community, to still have the government do more and more, and to incorporate companies, but actually that everyday citizens should also protect themselves and should be trained in counterintelligence, maybe even do some form of intelligence themselves. If you think about an organization like Bellingcat, which is kind of a citizen journalism site, can imagine everyday citizens doing this, and think about it as like, we have the police to protect us from crime, and they're professional people. We also have neighborhood watches, right? Which go back decades. And in fact, go back centuries. If you just think of Paul Revere as just some guy who was a silversmith, living in Massachusetts and decided that he wanted to watch out for the British. So we have this kind of culture of, we can have a government, but we can protect ourselves, and we can decentralize this need for security. And I think that's the way through the dilemma that keeps us away from a Stasi-like, all of society, centralized government control of intelligence that would endanger rights and freedoms.
So I see your Bellingcat and raise you a QAnon. The sort of mobilizing the hackers, mobilizing the masses. Like there's the nice version of it, which is like the Wikipedia. I thought was an interesting idea of like a sort of crowdsourced like font of knowledge, right? But it just seems to me like when you get Americans like being online and being skeptical, like all of a sudden you have 30% of the country believing that, there were pedophiles under a pizza restaurant in DC. And I don't know if that's doing more help than good. And I think also on the sort of like mobilizing the talent perspective, the Chinese and the Russians, they do this kind of explicitly, right? Where they have like, relations with organized crime and they use contractors. But aren't we kind of getting that with like CrowdStrike and Google like being the first line of defense against a lot of this hackers? Like, do we need it to be more democratized than what we already have? From that perspective of what the American technology community is already doing?
I would actually place the first line of defense at the individual level, like what you yourself are doing. And I talk about in the book, during the Cold War, there's this idea that the battle line was the Fulda Gap, right, in Europe between the US and the Soviets. And now that Fulda Gap is your cell phone, right? Because we're up against data collection and information operations and things like that. And so that first line of defense is a person, it's an individual citizen sitting there and deciding what to believe, what to not believe, what to forward, what to like, how to protect their data, right? Now they can use tools like CrowdStrike and Google and so forth, but ultimately it comes down to their decisions and our decisions, right? And we have realized this in cybersecurity, right? And people are trained to do cybersecurity from age 5, right? Our whole society has been trained to change passwords and not fall for phishing scams and all these kinds of things. But we don't, for some reason, want to do that for an even deeper threat, which is, a foreign adversarial intelligence agency trying to collect your information or trying to convince you of something in cognitive warfare. And I think that where it starts is that defense at an individual level to realize what's going on, and then have some basic tools like analytical triangulation, for example, to allow you to kind of cut through the untruths and so forth and make up your mind. And that really is where it has to begin. And then I think there are organizational structures that could be built around that. And I do talk about in the book that Wikipedia is a great example of this. And I even kind of have this line that in some ways, Wikipedia is the biggest intelligence agency in the world, right? Like they are providing information on essentially everything, collecting it through sources, and then analyzing it and continuously updating it and changing it. And there are essentially what you could call counterintelligence threats to it, where people are trying to sabotage information there, and there's a means for dealing with that. And so we can imagine, and I do in the book, kind of like a thought experiment of what an agency would look like. But it all is built upon this idea of individual responsibility and individual training, you could call it, in intelligence and counterintelligence.
I think that's really interesting. I do wonder, one, if the ubiquity of the threats, like when we talk about like data and information, and the fact that, like you said, since 5, you're basically taught to be able to control that, how to monitor that. That ubiquity then kind of almost makes the threat seem less important to people. But then also, how does that individual structure, as we're talking about, even if it gets into like the Wikipedia style, how does that contribute to, and I think you termed this really well, the prevent strategic surprise mission of like the IC? How do you see those like kind of tying together?
Yeah. We have this history in intelligence of these strategic surprises, right? Pearl Harbor, 9/11, and that's what many people associate as the very nature of strategic surprise and the thing that we're solving for. But there's other types of strategic surprise that are much more subtle, right? It's these boiling of the frog kind of situations where you don't realize it's happening until it's too late. And in some ways, we could look at the rise of China over the last 15 years in a military and economic manner that is not beneficial to America as one of those. And I think going forward, there are going to be more of those types of situations where it's very subtle, it's very slow, it's very hard to see what's happening until it's too late. And that's on purpose. I think adversaries have realized that we as a nation and our national security community is not good at dealing with those kinds of surprises, those kinds of threats. And so they're purposely using them, or where they're threats that are hard to pin down. It's not even clear who's making the threats. They're maybe using proxies. They're plausibly deniable. It's just confusing and chaotic. And those kinds of threats, again, are hard for our traditional national security community to grasp, yet they're in many ways equally as dangerous as something like a Pearl Harbor, because they threaten not just kind of military political issues, but they threaten the whole nation and even democracy itself in some ways.
Yeah. So we opened on, Trump finally in September saying that, Russia is a problem. I think, at some point in the book, you criticize in the fall of 2024, it was like CISA or something saying, like we think there's, some influence operations maybe going on that we're worried about. One of these strategic surprises that kind of crept up on us slowly and then all of a sudden is the fact that an ex-president, now a current president, thinks that this war is Ukraine's fault, right? And has basically bought into a narrative which is propagated entirely by Russia, that maybe they're Nazis and they had this coming, and we're fighting a war of liberation or what have you. So it's just coming back to the QAnon thing, like what is like the Straussian reading is like whenever people say, it comes back to like education. Like my reading of that is like, oh, we're just fucked. Like we can't. Like that's what we're counting on. We're really in trouble here.
I would analyze it and assess it like this. There is a difference between what politicians are saying publicly about threats and what they're going to do about threats and what is actually happening. In fact, either overtly through military exercises or covertly through non-military uses and so forth. And the two things, we should separate them. And so I do think and I think that these, call them information operations or, kind of chaotic, I think you're getting at like conspiratorial type situations, affect those two things differently. And they can affect the public discussion of a topic in one way, which can be very extreme and chaotic and be all over the place. And you have politicians talking about things, but then affect the actual activities of national security organizations and units in a totally different way. And so we might be much more rational and much more hawkish, let's say, in what we're doing, but maybe talking about it differently. And it can be really hard to analyze those two things separately.
Yeah. I mean, we're really testing that thesis right now.
I counted here for two questions. One of which is, like what are, as we transition from, the GWAT into this, next revolution, focusing on both on great power, but as you said, basically whole of society, intelligence gathering. What are the things that people commonly get wrong when they talk about the challenges the IC is having right now? And the second part being how, there's this constant debate of how much information you share. Because on one side, you have the people who are like, we should share everything and let the people decide. And there's obviously hazards with that. And the other half is, well, we should compartmentalize everything. And there's obvious hazards with that. And I would argue one of the hazards is for 20 years, we weren't good at sharing information with the public about what was going on in the conflicts in which we engaged. And then Kabul happens, Ukraine happens, Taiwan crisis 22 happens, and all of a sudden the public is exposed to all this information at a rate that the government cannot control, nor does any policymaker want. So how do you do that in a way that, keeps the public informed, but still protects our secrets?
Yeah. Great question. Part of the point of me writing the book in the first place is that I don't think that the American public really understands intelligence. They don't really understand what's going on in it. And at the same time, it's really important that they do understand because it has a massive effect. And if you compare it to the military, for example, we're actually pretty good at explaining to the American public what's going on in the military. We have briefings by, Chairman Dan Kane after the strike on Iran. We have public debates about how the military should be run. We have, information shared at essentially every level from, privates and corporals and lieutenants, writing blog posts all the way up to generals writing about their experiences, right? We have a pretty good idea of what's going on. And the same in law enforcement, more or less. But intelligence, it's different because most of what's in intelligence is classified, yet it's no less important. And so part of what I wanted to do in the book is kind of create a space for more debate. I mean, even if you just look at it, how many think tanks are there on the military? Dozens. How many are there on intelligence? None, right? There are some small groups within other think tanks that do intelligence, but that's it. And most of what people get about intelligence comes from movies. So, getting at your question, I do think that it's important that we share more. The intelligence community should share more with the American public about what's going on. And during the Biden administration, they started doing it with strategic declassification. That was part of the war planning and so forth, but it showed that it could be done in a process-driven, kind of rational way that had a different relationship between the intelligence community and the American public. So I think that more of that would be more useful. And this administration is doing the same in different ways where they're sharing information. And I think the culture of that should become part of the culture of intelligence, where there is some thought to what should be shared with the American public. The problem is that how do you balance security with that? And so you need a process to ensure that you're not releasing sources and methods and and things like this that would endanger sources, and that the intelligence community in some ways is becoming politicized. It's always been somewhat politicized, going back to essentially 1947. It's always been part of a political debate, but now much more explicitly by all sides in the equation, by the way. And I don't think anybody wants it to be politicized. And so we also want it to not share some types of information on purpose so that it doesn't become more politicized. And we have to balance that in the dilemma as well.
Does the DNI, like the creation of the DNI position and the movement of the IC kind of under one umbrella, did that contribute to some of the lack of transparency because you didn't have as much jockeying between the IC, between the different analysts? Or does that still exist and that's just not what's made public?
Yeah, it's an interesting question to consider. I think that one of the actual good things about the intelligence community and our culture of intelligence in general is that it is decentralized. And you do have these scenarios where CIA might come up with one view and DIA comes up with a different view. And that is actually that's a feature, not a bug, right?
For some.
The DNI is a weird middle ground now because in theory, they can override to some extent. I mean, the DNI ultimately is the cabinet member, and not the DCIA, or any of the other directors. And so in theory, they can override it. In theory that they can, centralize a view. But I would say still in practice within these organizations, and I don't know, but I would say probably still within the NSC, there are these multiple views coming in, and that's a good thing for decision makers.
So the intelligence community has a history, particularly in America, of swinging wildly, often at the direction of politicals, between paramilitary activities and a focus on traditional intelligence gathering. To your point about how there's no longer just a Folda gap, it's everywhere. Where does that start to blend going forward? And what's the correct balance for this day and age?
This goes back to the beginning of intelligence, right? OSS had covert action, and it had intelligence gathering and centralizing intelligence analysis. It had all of the pieces. And then in 1947, and even in the lead up between the war and the formation of the CIA, those pieces were still around. They were kind of split up, and the Army got some pieces, the State Department got some pieces, CIA kind of grabbed other pieces. So we've always had this sort of fracturing of those two things, and there's been this oscillation over time between covert action, the importance of covert action, and the importance of traditional intelligence collection. And I think one of the main components of this fourth intelligence revolution is that intelligence collection and covert action are now converging more than we've ever seen. And that when you look at threats from foreign adversary intelligence agencies, think China and Russia and so forth, they're both collecting information on everyone, essentially, not just kind of presidents and generals, but everyone, and performing covert action like covert influence on everyone at the same time. And because of the way these tools work, the data analytics, the AI, the technologies behind influencing someone today, it involves both collection and action. So it's kind of converging. So you collect a bunch of information on, say, how someone behaves when they're on social media, like TikTok, and then you use that against them because now you know how they think and how you should target a package of a piece of covert influence at them. So the two things are converging. And that means on the defense side, you now have to deal with both issues. How do I stop this data collection, but also how do I stop this covert influence? And the two things are intertwined. And you have to deal with how do I stop it from happening to these traditional people that I want to protect, like a congressman or a general or a diplomat, but also to regular people. So it's this really kind of complex interplay. And again, it's a true dilemma in that there's no great solution, but my proposed solution is the only way to deal with it is to have, again, this kind of police and neighborhood watch interchange, because the last thing you want now, so you want agencies to stop whatever is the next Internet Research Agency, IRA, threat to America. And that has to be done by the professionals, right? You're not going to have a Bellingcat shut down, a GRU funded organization. But
why? I mean, aside from it being, would it even be illegal for?
Well, you would have to maybe send someone over there.
Okay.
You want to really send over just, an average person to show up in St. Petersburg and say, hey, stop doing this? Or do you, hack into their bank accounts to, stop the flow of money going into the organization? It'd be really hard to do it.
Okay, but just like the idea of like letters of marque and reprisal. If we really want to like get back to our heroic age and we want to decentralize this stuff, if the US government says, this group of hackers in China is a problem, get at it. And then all of a sudden, it's not just the American, then you have the whole world mobilized. Okay, $20 million, $50 million. Sure, why not? I mean, wouldn't that be like a more effective use of resources and actually like deliver the thing that we're looking for?
I do like the idea of privateers and letters of marque. I do think it will be a solution going forward, but it doesn't actually get at the core issue because it's still the government deciding what to focus on. And you still would run into the same politicalization issue, which is they decide to shut down one group, but not another.
Yeah.
And whereas if it's civilians, if it's the populace, the civil society doing it themselves, then we are all deciding more directly. And so you remove a lot of that politicalization issue, right? And that's really the hardest thing to do, because you don't want, I don't think anybody wants the CIA or the DNI to decide what we get to see on the internet. Nobody wants this, right? And so, but when you talk about a foreign malign influence center, for example, you essentially fall into that trap. Now you're talking about that. Now you're talking about the government deciding what an American should read or not read. And that is a sticky situation nobody wants to be in. So we need to think outside the agency to do that. Think outside the box of agency construct completely. And this is why I call it a revolution. It's not an evolution. This is like way outside. It's so different. Like if you went to somebody in 1920 and you said, hey, in 30 years, not only are we going to have a peacetime intelligence agency, we're going to have like 5 of them, and we're going to spend a huge portion of our national budget on them, and they're going to do covert action all over the world, and they're going to be in every U.S. embassy and most American cities, they would have looked at you like you were insane.
Yeah.
They would be like, get out of here. What you're talking about is never going to happen in America. And I think that we need to think about what is this going to look like? And we needed that to fight the KGB. That's what we needed. We would have lost if we didn't have that. Well, to fight this next fight, we need to think about that crazy of a situation where it does seem crazy to have agencies doing one thing, and then we have just regular people out there doing this, and privateers, and we have, a Wikipedia on steroids intelligence agency that's made up of civilians and college kids. But it's going to be that different. I think that's the only way to get at this next threat.
What is the Pearl Harbor that would make all of the changes which you're suggesting in this book, none of which I think are actually that crazy, like real salient things?
does the inverse of doing this, does it look like the Great Firewall for every nation? And is that like the salient point is you either have to go Great Firewall and wall off your information environment a la DeepSeek Huawei partnership, or you're going to have an open society, then you're going to have to build anti fragility within the society.
The next Pearl Harbor is just sort of notoriously difficult to predict, right? It's a true black swan. And if I knew it, I would be warning everybody. And it wouldn't be the next Pearl Harbor in that case. But I think that it is going to have to do with AI in information operations and that end of the spectrum, and us realizing something really scary as a nation that's happened. And it is probably going to be a boil the frog kind of moment that all of a sudden everybody catches up on and is like, oh my God, like, how did we get here? And we all freak out. And part of the point of the book is to proactively describe what could go wrong and what we should start organizing for now to protect ourselves from that happening. And this is always the problem with intelligence in general, is that when you succeed, nothing happens. You don't know that you succeeded. So my goal as a former intelligence officer is to actually never have there be a Pearl Harbor, and we get there first, and we have reorganized, and we have, fixed the system before it's too late. And the Pearl Harbor ends up just being a whimper, and we barely notice it because we weren't threatened.
Yeah. I think the frog boiling, the closest metaphor we have now is TikTok, right? It grew slowly and fast, but it was like a 5-year arc. The 5-year arc to do our next big, intelligence reorg and legislation, like maybe that's too slow if AI comes at us really fast. I don't know. The one like vision of the one Pearl Harbor vision I have, I think we've talked about a little bit in the past, this idea of like foreign influence via your AI companions. I mean, I think all of us to some extent or another have are developing a dependency with ChatGPT or Claude, and the fact that 30% of AI companions globally are Chinese owned and operated seems to me to be a wild fact. When your senator falls in love with the Chinese, we don't have to fall in love with people. You don't need to put people on Capitol Hill anymore. You just put their AI bots. That can be your new honeypot operation. And I don't even know if that's a scandal big enough to blow up America.
Well,
but
if only someone had written a whole book in which the first stripe was an AI-enabled disinformation operation. If only someone had done
Tony,
that.
come on, let's.
Those fans who have not read my book, that is the first day of the war of World War III, is an AI-enabled disinformation operation where the American people are the Chinese for.
I refer to this in the book as hacking minds, and this idea that in a traditional information operation, it's a one-way street. You put out propaganda, in essence, people see that, and you try to change people's mind. What AI allows you to do is have a two-way street, to have a dialogue, because the AI could say something, and then I'm going to respond, and then the AI can say something back. And I think that that's a whole new form of information operation that's going to change everything, a whole new form of cognitive warfare in general. And what it allows you to do is not only convince people of something, but potentially do it so subtly over such a time period, they don't even know that it's happening. It's like incepted into their mind. And I even talk about this point where you could start recruiting people, in essence, without actually recruiting them.
Sure.
You could make them think to themselves, I should leak this information. And they would pass a polygraph. They wouldn't consider themselves to be a recruited spy, but they are. And those types of threats are really, really dangerous. And we need a completely new way of dealing with them. And part of it is around technology. I talk about in the book how we maybe need tools. I call it like a Socrates tool that might ask you questions about what you're hearing to try to get you to think about what's going on. Because if it said something, it might become part of the problem, right? So, but if it asks questions, it could help people to understand these threats and question them. But also part of it is around creating resiliency and this anti-fragility like you talk about. And I think where that begins is, again, training people, giving people a lens to look at the world from a young age and having, call it defense in depth, right? All the way back to people. And I think as society decentralizes more and more and AI becomes more and more prevalent and we all have this AI Jarvis that walks around with us all of the time, it's always going to come back to the individual and how they're reacting. And we need to start to think about that in terms of security as well.
Yeah. So you have a lot in this book about, the ways in which the intelligence community, at less than like an abstract society level, but just at a more tactical and operational level, needs to like get with the program. And, part of your arc in the late 2010s was trying to get people to buy commercial software and use what's out there and not use this really outdated like 1990s tech stack to do this analysis. And on the one hand, like it's obvious it needs to happen, like your information processing ability is like orders of magnitude faster, better, and smarter when you have tools, powerful tools doing it. But there are so many new vectors that you're going to need to protect against. The more you kind of like hand off to algorithms. So what's the question? I guess I feel like we're just gonna fail before I feel like that in itself is, there's going to be some like spoofing moment where like, this was kind of the story with the Gaza, with October 7th in Gaza, right? Where like there was this belief that all the sensors would tell you everything you needed to know.
I like to think about intelligence. The way to do it is to have this barbell strategy where you need on one end of that barbell as much information as you can get, and especially open source information, especially when you're addressing issues like economic threats or science and technology threats. You need to reach out into the open source world to get information about that, to analyze it. You need to adopt the tools that are coming from that commercial world. And that's part of what I was trying to do at NGA. You need to use whatever sensor you get your hand on. And so at NGA, we tried to bring in a lot of commercial satellite imagery, which was starting to happen then, which was a crazy thing to think about because 50 years ago, all satellites were, these massive, super expensive government things that cost $1 billion, to get up into space. And all of a sudden now we had commercial companies with these things. We need that. But I agree with you. There is a threat to anything open source like that. And there is a weakness to that. So we need this other end of the barbell, which is the secure stuff. We need the classified collection capability. We still need those $1 billion satellites that can do something not only that is impressive, that allows you to collect information, but also that the adversary doesn't even know about. They're not even sure what it can do. So you have this like surprising capability they can't even protect against, right? They think that it can't see X, but it can, it turns out, right? Because you've figured out some amazing magical technological capability to do that. And so we need both to secure the nation. And sometimes there's this debate within the intelligence community of like people who really want there to be more open source and that it would be this cure-all. And the other people are like, we only need classified. I don't need any open source. And I think that debate is misplaced. I think we need both, and we need both like in bulk and in strength.
I think with that, looking at the tech and especially the commercialization, do you see, the one thing that overwhelmingly is taken for granted is that people who work in the US government are, loyal to the US government. They have that as like kind of the forefront of their mind. Is there a worry when we start looking at some of these tech companies, especially the aggregators like a Palantir or name any of the other ones? There's been tons that have come out. That they start to have misaligned incentives or objectives?
Yes. I don't think it's an if question. There is a misalignment, right? Just in the sense that if you're in the government, you have an incentive structure. If you're in a company, you have a different incentive structure. If you're at a nonprofit or a think tank, you have a different incentive structure, right? Everybody has that. And even within government agencies, that's the case. I mean, frankly, some people are incentivized because they are total patriots and they just care about mission. Some people are more incentivized by rising up the ladder and getting into positions of power and authority, right? So and I think this isn't new. This was the case even when we had contracting companies during the Cold War building these things. And we have allies who are part of the intelligence community, like Five Eyes, or NATO and so forth. So there's always this sort of spectrum of incentives in place. And the key thing is for people who are managing these agencies is to balance that incentive structure towards accomplishing this mission. Now, I think your point, though, that now there's so many more defense technology companies involved. It's not that they're a new player, they've been around for a while, but now they're a much bigger player than we're used to. And many of them are dual use in the sense that they also have commercial customers in a way that, most of the contracting companies didn't during the Cold War. And that they want actively to build technology that is supposed to give us this competitive advantage on one end of the barbell, but also they want to go sell it to companies or so forth. And so there's this new issue to deal with. And that's where we do need kind of new processes, and we need to be aware of what they're doing. And we shouldn't look to them as this cure-all. Again, I think there's this view that if we just used more Palantir or used more Anduril or used more insert, your company, we would just be able to solve everything. I think we need some of them, of course, because they are fast and they are good and they are creative. But we also need to balance that off with other capabilities that make up for some of the misplacement of incentive.
I want to come back to this idea of AI getting better and better and what we're going to do about it. So you have this whole chapter about the singularity war, which, given that you locked this text in a year ago, I find deeply impressive and pilled in a way that I think a lot of the national security community isn't today and definitely was not a year ago. Basically the idea that, look, if we're pricing progress in, and by the way, a year ago, people talked about hallucinations. Today, they don't anymore because they're pretty much gone. Like the amount of change at, tactical and operational levels of war, as well as like within the intelligence cycle collection, is just going to be like, computers are just going to strictly dominate a lot of that, as long as you can trust them, which is a big if. But kind of let's maybe talk about, but before we talk about like how that bubbles up to the strategic level, like what is your mental model of like how that competitive dynamic towards, handing the reins over to the AI and different agencies will end up playing out, or should play out? I don't know.
I would draw this parallel between warfare and financial market trading. And people in markets at hedge funds and so forth, there used to be people who would read about what was going on with a company, come up with a thesis, go trade a stock. And there were lots and lots of people doing this all at the same time, and you created this market. And then over time, they created quantitative ways to do this. So hedge funds like Renaissance Technologies went out and realized you could have a machine collect all the information about the stocks, do all of the analysis, and then make the trade. And in some cases, make the trade really, really fast, like nanosecond fast. And we've hit a point now where people, regular people, essentially a normal human being, even a really, really smart one, can't keep up with the machines in financial markets. And they have to use these analytical systems and high-speed trading systems to compete. But everybody's using them. So now you're in this place where you have one machine analytical quantitative system trading against another, and now they're competing. And I think the same thing is happening in and going to happen in both intelligence and in warfare, where these analytical systems are going to collect information and analyze it and use that to help make a decision. And then it's just going to feed that ultimately directly into an operational system like a drone, or maybe even into a strategic level decision. The enemy is going to do the same thing. They're going to have their machine analytical AI driven system feeding it into their machine drone and so forth. And you're now just getting to reach this point where warfare becomes just between machines, and where intelligence and operations just merge because all the machines are both collecting information and then acting on it. We're already sort of seeing this at this small scale in Ukraine, where you have drones that are both sensors, but they can also drop a grenade, right? And now imagine this proceeding to a point where all of or most of the systems in the theater of war are like this. They're machines, they're collecting information and operating all at the same time. And it's happening so fast and at such a scale of complexity that people essentially can't keep up. And I call this a singularity war in the sense of that at that point, we're not even really sure what will happen because it's going to be evolving so rapidly, like we can't tell what's going to happen. And that I use that as a thought experiment to think of like, okay, well, knowing that might be the case in a few years, or call it 5, call it 10, whatever time period, what do we need to start doing today to prepare for that as an intelligence community and as a society?
So I want to extend the finance metaphor and bring in a former employer of both of ours, Bridgewater, in The Fund, which was a kind of like gossipy book that came out last year. It sort of walked through this arc that Ray had with Ferducci, who was the guy who made IBM Watson, and he brought in to basically build an algorithm to rate all of the employees based on their skills and abilities by having the have everyone in the firm like give real-time feedback to everyone else. And basically what started happening was Ray wasn't the most smart, authoritative person because people had feelings about him, or maybe he just wasn't, who knows. And so Ray kept giving notes to Ferducci. Your algorithm's wrong. It's not right. I think this guy's smarter than that guy. I think this woman's more creative than this person. And he has a big, he has a big spiel to them. And then the climax of the chapter is Ferducci's voice came back barely above a whimper saying, "That's not a valid algorithm." Dalio cocked his head back, surprised at the answer. Ferducci's eyes welled up and he said, his voice quavering, "That's not scientific, Ray. The team just couldn't make changes based on Dalio's whims. That's not how I work. I can't take direction like this." And the idea that a sort of senior figure, be it a president who doesn't want to listen to what the DIA says, or someone who's running a hedge fund and doesn't want to listen to what their quant guy says, like, if they're right in the finance world, then great. They make more money, they get better returns, they have an AUM. If they're not, then they get competed out of business, right? Like, if we have sort of strategic, it's sort of fine for society in the end. But it almost seems to me like at the end of the singularity, like the instant of the singularity war is the gut instinct of whichever principal is actually going to be in charge and still in the loop or on the loop. Like, that one person's just sense of the world is so, like, their importance is like even more amplified than it has ever been, because you're going to have so many fewer actual other human brains who are like touching the stuff. Or you draw a conclusion. What's the right analogy? What's the takeaway from this?
I mean, at this level, we're really talking about competitions and competitive advantage. And how do you win in a competition? The irony is that Ray's point in his books, and I would say his life, is that you need idea meritocracy because the best idea will win, right? No matter how you feel about something, no matter what your ego tells you, it doesn't matter when you're trading a stock. The only thing that matters is, did you make the right decision about trading a stock? And was it better than the other guy's decision? That's the only thing that matters. And he talks about in his books about how he tried to build an organization that could do that better than any other organization in the world. And that's the organization we were part of. Intelligence and military and national security activities are essentially the same thing. We can have politicians and presidents and different people involved disagree with whether something is quote unquote true or factual or not, and whether this is the best take or not. The only thing though that matters in the competition is whether it is or it isn't. And the difference though is that for a hedge fund, if the hedge fund loses a trade, that's bad for the hedge fund, but it doesn't matter for society. If a country does it badly, that's bad for all of us in national security. And this is why this, going back to the earlier discussion, decentralization of intelligence is so important. One agency might be wrong, but the other agency might be right. And this has happened. It happened with the Iraq War, a war that some of us went to for reasons that many of us no longer consider to be justifiable. And because of bad intelligence, and the belief in bad intelligence is the important thing. It's not just the intelligence itself, it's whether someone in a position of authority believes it or not. And so this crosses all the revolutions. It really gets at the nature of what intelligence should be, is it's information used to make a decision. It's there to give you a competitive advantage. And politicians can disagree with that, but the people making decisions really need to take a step back and look at this as, am I going to win or lose in this competition? And I need to remove politics, and I need to remove ego, and I need to think about this as, how do I win? How do I do better than my enemy wants to do to me?
This idea of playing like economic espionage with one hand tied behind America's back. The norm that the U.S. has tried to promulgate around the world about how economic espionage and economic sabotage is like not something that we play with, from my perspective, like is the thing that came up in the 90s when we had no competitors and we didn't want, we wanted to sort of solidify our place in the top. What is your take on stealing, battery secrets from Chinese companies? I mean, stuff that isn't really all that kind of dual usey, but just like part of a broader economic competition. I mean, now that we're taking bites of companies and turning Intel into like a new SOE, like why not just give them a little more of a NSA helping hand, NSA style helping hand?
As China has been rising over the last 15 or 20 years, they realized that they could not compete head on with the US in military or even diplomatic or political terms. I assume you would agree with that. And they had to turn to asymmetric means of competition. And economics was a big area for them to turn to. And they began to weaponize economic competition. In one sense, that's stealing IP and technologies and then using it to build up their defense industrial base. In another sense, that's using economic means to take over ports and other strategic assets in the world, or to punish countries by not allowing them to sell into the Chinese market as a means to push them diplomatically, right? In the US, we really were not accustomed to that form of competition because we were essentially closed off from the Soviet economy during the Cold War. And then we moved and we traded freely within our side of the world and then sort of took that globalization mindset with us. So we didn't really need economic intelligence at that time. It wasn't that useful. We did it in small amounts always. But now that there's this economic threat surface area, we need something to protect ourselves on the one hand. So to know what they're doing in the economic domain, know what they're trying to steal from us, or how they're going to use economic tools to harm American interest, but also to support our own economic operations. And that might be things like, it's true, taking a piece of technology that they have, which we cannot live without, and stealing it, in essence, and providing it to American companies. That could be a path. That's a policy decision to do that. It's not actually an intelligence community decision.
Sure.
But the intelligence community should have the capability, should a president or other policymaker say, we need to do this, this is my policy, the intelligence community should have the capability to fulfill that for their customer. And similarly, a president or another policymaker, decision maker may want to be able to use similar economic tools as China to support diplomatic actions by harming their economy in some way that helps our situation. And again, the intelligence community should be able to provide the information they need to make that decision and then to execute it, potentially through intelligence operations or even through covert action. So if we're going to compete, the job of the intelligence community is to help decision makers compete, and they need to build up the muscles to be able to do that. And we just simply don't have them.
Yeah.
Do you think in some ways that it's a differentiation without a distinction when foreign nations look at like the YouTube censorship or actions like Snowden's leaks, and they see the intelligence agency or the administration working within these private companies and influencing them to do things on their behalf? Are we just not calling them SOEs and other people see them that way? Do we think there's a distinction there?
I think that there's a big distinction between control and influence, right? An SOE, a Chinese SOE, is controlled by the government in a very, very real way. And then there are some companies like a Huawei or an Alibaba that aren't true SOEs, but are heavily influenced by the government. And ultimately controlled in the sense that everyone in a communist society like China can be told explicitly by the government what to do, to give data, to do something. And they can do that without recourse to a judge or any other law. They can just be told by the party to do something. That's control. In the US, we very rarely have control like that. Government agencies are controlled by the president, right? Companies, even when, say, part of Intel is owned by the government, that does not provide control. They cannot force it to do things. You can use a golden share to influence, but you couldn't just simply say, at least today, from what I've seen, you couldn't just say, hey, Nippon Steel and US Steel, I want you to, start making cars and selling them below cost to African countries. Like they couldn't do that. And so I do think that there's a big difference there, and it really gets to the heart of the difference between American society and Chinese society and our economic systems. And actually, I think it's a safer place to be where we are, because centralized decision making, especially in economic areas, has proven time and again to be a bad idea. It just doesn't work.
I mean, it's really interesting, 'cause, like, the whole sort of like chimerica, like we're just sort of synthesizing into each other, as over the course of this conversation, and over the course of the first 9 months of this administration in particular, it seems like just a lot, even though, there is a big difference, but the between what Trump is doing in the U.S. and what's happening in China in the sort of like media ecosystem space, and the way that like Cask can tell companies what to do. But the sort of using trade as a diplomatic lever, taking bites out of companies, politicizing intelligence to a degree that I think even Republicans would acknowledge was like not really. I don't know. We haven't seen like sort of civil servants be fired for the sorts of things they've been fired for over the past few months. There's a vector that I think you can see, which is sort of taking us towards really engaging with or like grappling with a lot of the tools that the Chinese government has been able to work with. And, we'll have some weird fit synthesis, which does not mean that we are ruled by one party and a president who's around for 20 plus years. But it's just coming back to this is now I'm rambling. But coming back to this sort of like needing to mobilize the population stuff, I don't know. There was a lot of pattern matching during the Cold War as well, where all of a sudden the DoD decides that it needs 5-year plans in order to compete with McNamara, right? So it just on the one hand, like you can see the synthesis continuing, but I think there's also a world where there is a Nixon level scandal that the Trump administration goes too far, whether it's from corporate control, whether it's from weaponizing the intelligence community to do domestic stuff, where you have a backlash from all of this. And so I don't know.
There is this interesting dynamic in competitions and in war where the two sides kind of converge over time. And in the Cold War, we created our version of the KGB, right? We saw this, the Russians had a long history of internal and external intelligence function. We're very good at it, and we had to compete with it. And so we had to create something that in many ways paralleled it. Now, we did it in our own way, though. We separated the two out. For example, the KGB had both internal and external security, and we left the CIA's only having essentially an external function. So we didn't go all the way, but there was a convergence. And even after 9/11, if you look at this, America was competing against Al-Qaeda, this highly decentralized, networked organization, and we started using highly decentralized, networked, small group approaches. All of a sudden, JSOC and these small teams were everywhere and acting in some ways like a terrorist group. Not to say that they were doing terrorism, but that they were operating in small teams. They were not acting like a normal military unit, force on force. And so we adopted some similar ways of fighting. The same thing is happening now, where we are adopting some of the approaches of China in order to compete with them. But again, doing it in our own way and hashing out what is too far. How far are we willing to go, and how far is too far? Because it clashes with some other constraint in our society or our economic system. And we're in that messy part of the process right now where we're hashing it out. And I think it will take a few years to do it, just like in the beginning of the Cold War. It took us a few years to figure out how intelligence should work. And there were some, to put it lightly, gaffes in the 1950s.
Sure.
And then over time, though, we did stabilize the system, and it was on a trajectory. The same thing's going to happen here in economic competition, I think.
All right.
Yeah, I think that's really the flexibility in the system. Like you said, from 53 to 57, it looked like if you had read newspapers, you would have thought that the Soviet Union was going to win the Cold War. Even into the early 60s with the space race, with the, Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin in the way they were leading. And then what we saw was that, again, there was a fragility in their system that didn't allow for competing thoughts and competing interests to be able to percolate up to the top. That is where the hope, I think, from the U.S. side to extrapolate that out onto both the defense and intelligence side, is the hope exists that those good ideas are still going to be able to percolate up, and there's an adaptability inherent in the system that maybe doesn't exist in a more stovepiped single-party system.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to my Ray Dalio as a CCP leader, like the fact is we do have elections, right? And there is some sort of feedback loop, even if they don't happen all that frequently. They still happen more frequently than power transitions in China, and sort of the downside, over a 50-year horizon, the downside risk of having someone suck continually for 20 of them is worse than having someone be a subpar performer for 4 or even 8 years. So
yeah, I mean, no, there's a history thing there, right? Like, I forget who it was who pointed out that, like, by the time you got to World War One, if you looked at the European leaders, you had basically gotten the worst roll of the genetic dice in the imperial powers across Central Europe and Russia, because you had just the leaders that were in place. They were all kind of like shells of the leaders that had put those families on the map and put them where they were. And the only nation that was able to kind of somewhat rise above that was the constitutional monarchy of Britain, which still had elected leaders who were actually making the decisions. So there is something to that. Like you said, there at least is an anti-fragility to it, to go back to the term of the day.
until we have our AI girlfriend president, brought to you by ByteDance.
Yeah. Yes.
All right. I think we'll probably call it here.